Hello. Everyone, I am daily train my brain, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. The town of Hollow Creek had always felt wrong, as though the land itself held its breath. Every fall, the mist rolled in thick and heavy, blanketing the streets and suffocating the houses until they were no more than dark shapes in a sea of gray. Elise de Turna had moved there to escape her past, seeking solitude in the small, forgotten town. But the whispers started on her first night, soft like the wind playing tricks, yet persistent enough to raise goosebumps on her arms. "It's just the old pipes," she told herself as she huddled beneath the heavy quilt, the ancient wood of the house creaking around her. But when the whispers came again, forming half words that skittered through the air, she sat up, heart pounding. The next morning she mentioned it to Mrs. Hart, her neighbor, who had the sharp eyes of a crow and a voice as thin as the mist itself. The old woman's smile faltered when Elise spoke of the sounds. "Best keep your windows shut tight, dear," Mrs. Hart said. "The night carries things that don't belong." That evening, Elise locked the windows and drew the curtains, but the whispers grew louder. They seemed to move like a current through the walls, brushing against her ears and sending shivers down her spine. And then she heard her name. "Elise." She spun around, eyes wide, the candle she held flickering wildly. Shadows danced across the room, but there was no one there. Floorboards creaked, and she swore she saw a figure in the hallway mirror. A tall, thin man with eyes as dark as the night. Sleep came in fits and starts. When she awoke, the morning sun felt sharp and harsh, as if trying to cut through the chill that clung to her bone. Elise pushed aside her fear and walked to the village bookstore, its shelves filled with leather-bound tomes and the scent of old paper. "Looking for something specific?" asked the shopkeeper, a stooped man with bushy brows that seemed almost alive. Elise hesitated, then blurted out, "Do you know anything about the voices?" The man's expression shifted, and he glanced over his shoulder. "The whispers," he whispered, as though the word itself could summon them. He reached under the counter and handed her a slim, worn book. Its cover bore no title, only a symbol. An eye surrounded by curling, inky tendrils. "Read it if you must, but be warned. Knowing their story invites them in," he said, before shuffling to the back room and locking the door behind him. Back at home, Elise sat by the fire and turned the brittle pages. The book spoke of the Hollow Ones, spirits that once thrived in the village long before humans arrived. They whispered to those who would listen, weaved their voices into minds and dreams until they found a way. Inside, a loud crash jolted her from the text. The window was open, curtains billowing like the wings of some monstrous bird. Elise's heart pounded as she approached, the whispers welling in a crescendo. "We see you," they murmured. The of unseen eye traced her skin. Suddenly, the mirror in the hallway shattered, sending shards skittering across the floor. In the fractured glass, Elise saw the tall, thin man. Only now his mouth moved, mimicking the voices. His eyes locked with hers, and she felt a tug, as if an invisible thread tied her to him. Elise screamed, backing away until she hit the wall. The voices turned cruel, laughing and weeping, filling her head with their suffocating presence. She clutched the iron candlestick from the mantel remembering an old superstition that iron repelled spirits. The whispers faltered as she held the iron aloft, her breath ragged. The gear in the mirror snarled silently before dissolving into the fog that now seeped through every crevice of the house. It's not enough. The voices whispered, fainter now, but still there. In a final act of desperation, Elise hurled the candlestick at the mirror, shattering what little remained. The room fell silent, the mist recoiling back as though wounded. The air felt thinner, freer, but the silence was sharp, waiting. Days passed, and the whispers did not return. But each evening, as the fog rolled in, Elise would catch a glimpse of the tall, thin man at the edge of the forest, his dark eyes glistening with a promise. She knew the fight was not over. The hollow ones were patient, and they would come for her again when the time was right. Elise spent the next few days repairing the shattered mirror and sealing the windows with salt, a precaution she read about in the mysterious book. The fog lingered outside, pressing against the house, but it hadn't crossed the threshold again. Yet that, the villagers watched her with wary eyes when she ventured outside. Mrs. Hart whispered to others as Elise passed by, with face tight with disapproval. She's brought their attention, Elise heard her say. Fear and superstition ran deep in Hollow Creek. Elise returned to the bookstore, determined to find answers. The shopkeeper seemed different, tired, with deep circles under his eyes. You shouldn't have read the book, he said quietly, his voice a rasp. Once they know your name, it becomes a game. What do they want? Elise asked, desperation creeping into her voice. The old man sighed, fingers tracing a symbol on the cover. To break free, to take root in the living world again. He pushed a small iron key across the counter. There's one place left that might help. Key belonged to the abandoned church at the far end of the village, overgrown with ivy and crumbling with age. It was said that the last priest who served there vanished, taken by the fog during the final chime of the midnight bell. Elisa hesitated at the iron gate, its rusted hinges groaning as she pushed it open. The whispers rose immediately, hissing from the dark corners. Her lantern's flame wavered, but held steady as she stepped inside, the air thick with dampness and dust. The church was littered with remnants of rituals, candles, tattered hymn books, and symbols scratched into the stone. At the altar, a leather-bound journal lay open, the ink smeared as though hastily written. They will come when called, it read. But they cannot touch iron or fire. A noise startled her, the sound of footsteps echoing in the empty church. She spun around to find Mrs. Hart standing in the doorway, a lantern of her own casting strange shadows over her lined face. You have brought them too close, girl, she said, her voice a harsh whisper. Why didn't anyone warn me? Elisa demanded, anger flaring in her chest. Mrs. Hart stepped closer, her expression softening, because they can only latch onto those who already carry darkness inside. We thought you might be different. But a chill ran down Elisa's spine. Her past was marked by tragedy, by secrets she had tried to bury when she moved to Hollow Creek. She remembered the voices that night, the way they seemed to reach for the hidden corners of her mind. The whispers fed on fear, on guilt. Mrs. Hart handed Elise a bundle wrapped in cloth. This is all that remains of Father Abbott's relics. Use them wisely. Inside were iron charms, and a small vial of oil that glowed faintly in the dim light. "Consecrated," the old woman said. Back home, Elise prepared for the night. She hung the iron charms by the windows and doors, tracing protective symbols with the oil on the threshold. As darkness fell and the fog thickened outside, she waited, the book and relics close at hand. The first whisper came just before midnight, slipping through the silence like a snake. "Elise." This time, the voice sounded familiar, echoing the tone of someone she had once loved but lost. Her hands shook as she gripped the vial of oil. Elise's pulse hammered as she poured the oil into the line before her, setting it alight with a trembling hand. The fire flared, casting a golden barrier between her and the figure. The whispers hissed and withdrew, but the thin man's smile widened. Elise's pulse hammered as she poured the oil in a line before her, setting it alight with a trembling hand. The fire flared, casting a golden barrier between her and the figure. The whispers hissed and withdrew, but the thin man's smile widened. "You think fire will stop us forever?" he asked, his voice no longer a whisper, but a deep, resonant rumble that shook the wall. The flame flickered, struggling against an unseen force, and Elise knew this was only the beginning. The thin man's silhouette melted back into the shadows, leaving only the echo of laughter behind. The fire sputtered out, and darkness reclaimed the room. Elise's heart sank as she realized the fight was far from over. Sleep was impossible that night, so Elise sat by the window, watching the fog shift and writhe like a living thing. The iron charms jingled softly, an uneasy reminder of their temporary protection. She needed more than relics. She needed understanding. Morning brought new resolve. Elise pored over the priest's journal and the worn book from the bookstore, piecing together fragments of lore. All the ones were bound by old laws, tied to a rift that opened in times of deep grief or betrayal. The whispers sought vessels to inhabit, souls marked by suffering. Elise's own memories surfaced, the guilt that had followed her to Hollow Creek, the loss that haunted her. She pressed the heel of her hand against her temple, willing the memories away. A knock at the door jolted her. It was Samuel, a village blacksmith, eyes wary and jaw set. "Mrs. Hart said you'd need this." He handed her an iron-tipped staff, its surface engraved with runes. It was made for the last battle, but it was never used. Elise's fingers tightened around the staff. "Why now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel looked out at the fog creeping through the streets. "Because they're stronger this time. They have a name, and they won't stop until they have you." The sun set, casting long shadows that stretched across the village. A sense of anticipation settled over Hollow Creek, heavy and oppressive. Elisa stood in her doorway, the staff at her side and the oil vial in her pocket. The first scream came from Mrs. Hart's house. Elisa ran out, thundering, to find the old woman on the floor, surrounded by fog that pulsed like a living thing. The iron charm she'd given Elise had kept it at bay, but weakened her home's defenses. Mrs. Hart's eyes opened, glassy and unfocused. "They know," she gasped, her voice brittle. "They know you're close to the truth." The fog around her thickened, pulling at her limbs. Elise swung the iron staff, slicing through the tendrils and sending them retreating. With a final, shuddering breath, Mrs. Hart whispered, finish what I could not. Her body went limp, eyes staring at nothing, as the whispers faded into the night. Elise stood, grief welling up. She had no time to mourn. The fog shifted outside, forming figures with hollow, hungry eyes. The thin man led them, his mouth a cruel line as he raised a hand, signaling the assault. Elisa felt the weight of the staff, its runes pulsing like a heartbeat. The battle began as the fog pushed against the door and windows, rattling the house. Elise traced the oil symbols with her fingers, igniting them again. The flames created a circle of light, trapping the hollow ones outside for now. The thin man stepped forward, his face pressed against the window, eyes like twin abysses. "Come, Elise," he called. "It's time to join your shadows." The fog seeped through the cracks, testing her defenses, and the whispers became a deafening roar. Elise steadied her breathing, feeling the iron staff warm in her grip. The runes glowed faintly, reacting to the proximity of the hollow one. She took a step toward the window, eyes locked with the thin man's. "You'll have to take me yourself," she whispered. The thin man's smile widened into something inhuman, stretching until it threatened to split his face in two. He reached out, pressing a hand against the glass. Cracks spider-webbed across the surface, and Elisa's heart hammered in her chest. She swung the staff, striking the window frame with a resounding clang. The sound reverberated through the room, pushing the whispers back for a moment. The figures outside recoiled, their faces melting into the mist before reforming. A loud thump came from behind her, and Elise spun around. The back door splintered as another shadow figure forced its way inside. Its movements were jerky, marionette-like, with limbs that stretched unnaturally, its hollow eyes locked onto hers. Elise thrust the staff forward, its tip igniting with a sudden burst of blue flame. The creature screeched, a sound that pierced the air and made the iron charms around the room shudder. It dissolved into a dark, inky pool on the floor, which slowly evaporated. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, and Elise knew they were rallying for something bigger. She grabbed the remaining iron charms and fastened them to the windows and doors, forming a lattice of protection that glowed with faint blue light. Outside, the fog churned violently, and more figures emerged. Some twisted beyond recognition, others resembling villagers who had gone missing over the years. Elise's stomach clenched as she spotted faces she had only heard about in local legends. The thin man stepped through the wall of fog, his form growing more solid with each step. The whispers turned into a chant, low and rhythmic, shaking the ground beneath her feet. "You belong to us," they intoned in unison. Elise felt a pang of fear twist inside her. The journal's warnings came rushing back. How the Hollow Ones could manipulate reality itself, bending space and time within their influence. She gripped the staff tighter, whispering a silent prayer. A sudden flash of movement caught her eye, and Samuel burst through the front door, sweat glistening on his brow and an iron blade in his hand. "You're not doing this alone," he said, breathless but determined. He positioned himself by her side, eyes locked on the thin man. The man raised one hand, and the figures surged forward as if commanded by a wave. Samuel swung his blade, striking at the nearest creature. The blade cut through it with ease, the iron leaving a sizzling trail. But for every shadow they defeated, two more emerged. "Elise," Samuel shouted, his voice strained. "The runes, they're not just for defense. Use them." He pointed to the staff, which pulsed with light whenever she moved. Realization dawned on her, and she traced one of the runes with her thumb, feeling it warm under her touch. The staff flared, a blinding arc of energy that erupted from its tip, pushing the shadows back and illuminating the thin man's true form. His skin cracked like old porcelain, revealing swirling darkness beneath. He roared, the sound mingling with the whispers into a cacophony. "Elise, now!" Samuel's shout jolted her into action. She stepped forward, raising the staff high and letting the runes guide her. The blue flame surged outward, meeting the thin man's outstretched hand. For a moment, the room fell silent as the energy crackled between them. The thin man's eyes narrowed, and a wicked grin split his face. He leaned into the energy, absorbing it, and for a terrifying moment, it seemed as though he would overcome her defenses. But then, Samuel pressed his iron blade into the man's shadow, piercing it like flesh. A deafening screech filled the air, and the thin man recoiled, his form splintering and shuddering. The other shadow figures paused, their hollow eyes flickering as if sensing the shift in power. Elise pushed harder, willing the staff's light to grow. Cracks spread across the thin man's face, widening until he burst apart, leaving a swirling vortex of black mist. The other figures shrieked and dissolved into the fog, which thinned and lifted as if chased by an unseen wind. The whispers faded into nothingness, and a heavy stillness settled over the room. Elise lowered the staff. Breath. Breath ragged and hands shaking, Samuel stood beside her, face pale but victorious. "It's over," he whispered, though it sounded more like a question than a statement. The first light of dawn crept over the village, golden and warm, cutting through the remnants of the fog. Hollow Creek seemed to sigh in relief as the oppressive presence lifted. Elise looked out the window, half expecting the shadows to return, but only sunlight greeted her. Mrs. Hart's house was empty now, a testament to the cost of their victory. Elise walked through the streets, noting the cautious smiles of the villagers who emerged from their homes, squinting into the morning light as if seeing it for the first time. Samuel touched her arm, drawing her attention. "We need to make sure they don't return," he said, nodding to the journal still clutched in her hand. Elise nodded, knowing he was right. The battle was over, but the war against the Hollow Ones had only begun. They spent the next few days reinforcing the village, teaching the others how to craft iron charms and carve runes. The bookshop keeper returned, more tired than before, but with a glimmer of hope in his eyes. He placed more volumes on the counter, texts filled with forgotten lore. Elise felt the weight of leadership pressing down on her, but she embraced it. The villagers looked to her now, their eyes no longer filled with fear, but with trust. Samuel stayed close, offering quiet words of encouragement and strength. The thin man's shadow, however, lingered in her dreams. Each night, she heard his voice echoing in the distance, promising a return. "We are patient, Elise. We will wait." And each morning, she awoke more determined to be ready. One evening, Samuel found her studying the journal by the fire, her eyes red with fatigue. He sat beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You saved us once. We'll be ready if they come back," he said, and for the first time, she believed him. Elisa spent days poring over the journal, now joined by the other ancient texts provided by the bookshop keeper. Each volume revealed fragments of truth about the Hollow Ones, where they came from, how they fed off fear, and the nature of their prison within the mist. Samuel worked with the villagers, teaching them to use iron-tipped spears and charms. The once quiet village square was now filled with the sound of clanging metal and whispered incantation. Children watched with wide eyes, absorbing the gravity of their new reality. Late one evening, while the village rested, Elise was jolted awake by a low hum. It vibrated through the floorboards, resonating in her bones. She sat up, heart thudding, and noticed the journal glowing faintly on her desk. She opened it with trembling hands. The runes etched on the pages rearranged themselves, forming new words. They are learning. They will return. This breath caught. The thin man's promise echoed in her ears. Racing outside, she found Samuel and a few villagers already gathered, weapons at the ready. The night sky glowed an unnatural purple, and a familiar fog rolled in from the woods, silent and swift. It coiled like a living thing, almost sentient. A chill swept through Hollow Creek, and out of the mist stepped new figures, taller, more formidable, with hollow eyes that burned with a sickly yellow light. They were not like the thin man. These were older, more ancient. Samuel tightened his grip on his spear. Elise, he called out without turning, his voice steady but low. This isn't the same as before. What do we do? His eyes, though hardened with resolve, held a glimmer of uncertainty. Elisa traced a rune in the air, its light forming a barrier between them and the advancing figure. We hold the line until know their weakness, she replied, channeling strength she wasn't sure she possessed. The figures moved as one, their limbs shifting like liquid shadow. They approached the barrier and tested it, long, skeletal fingers pressing into the light. The barrier shivered but held, emitting a hiss like burning oil. A piercing sound erupted, cutting through the village like a blade. Elise covered her ears, eyes squeezed shut, as did the others. The noise was an incantation of power, weaving doubt and fear into the minds of all who heard it. The barrier flickered, and for a terrifying moment Elise thought it would shatter. But the staff in her hand pulsed again, responding to her panic. She whispered the runes she had learned, feeling them pour out of her like water, binding the shield together. Samuel took the opportunity to rally the others, shouting orders that broke through the whispers in their heads. The villagers, shaking off their fear, tightened their ranks and prepared their iron-tipped weapons, eyes locked on the ancient figures. A voice, deeper than the thin man's and reverberating like a growl, echoed across the square. You defy us again, children of Hollow Creek. We will make you forget why you fought. The lead figure stepped forward, its hollow eyes sparkling with malice. Elise recognized this one from an illustration in the book, a harbinger, one who came before the true masters of the mist. Its form was covered in shifting runes that glowed and dimmed like a heartbeat. The battle had only just begun. The harbinger stretched out its arms, and the fog surged like a tidal wave, crashing against the barrier. The ground trembled, splitting the cobblestones under their feet. Samuel yelled, "Hold the line!" as the villagers gripped their weapons tightly. Elisa called on the runes once more, this time infusing them into the weapons of the villagers. Their tips glowed blue, and they surged forward, iron and magic striking at the fog and the creatures within it. The first clash was chaotic. Screams and metallic clangs mixed with the shrieks of the hollow ones. Iron met shadow, and sparks flew where runes made contact. Samuel's spear sliced through a creature, and it dissipated with a shriek, but two more took its place. A searing pain ran down Elise's arm, and she looked down to see a thin gash glowing with dark energy. She bit back a cry, knowing that faltering now would doom them all. She shifted the staff to her uninjured arm and whispered a binding spell to contain the wound. The Harbinger's eyes turned to her, sensing the blood. It moved faster, a blur of shadows and whispers, reaching for her. Samuel stepped in front of Elise, blocking the blow with his spear, but the force sent him sprawling to the ground. "No!" Elise shouted, releasing a blast of light from the staff. It struck the Harbinger square in the chest, forcing it back. The runes on its form sizzled, and it let out a guttural roar that silenced the battlefield. The Harbinger faltered, but its rage only grew. It raised its arms, and the mist around it condensed into sharp, needle-like projectiles that shot toward Elise and the villagers. Elise ducked, feeling one graze past her shoulder, a searing burn. Villagers cried out, a few falling as the projectiles found their mark. Samuel pushed himself up, blood running down his temple. "Elise," he called, eyes wide with fear, and something else, trust. He trusted her to end this. Summoning every ounce of willpower, Elise raised the staff high, letting the runes flow from her heart, from the deepest memories of her family who had once protected this place. The staff glowed brighter than ever, the blue flame now tinged with white. The Harbinger shrank back, its form flickering as though caught in a storm. "Cannot undo what was done," it hissed, its voice quaking. But the power in Elise's hands surged outward in waves, pushing the dark force to the edge of the village. A crack like thunder split the sky, and the purple light receded as quickly as it had come. The Harbinger's form splintered into fragments of shadow, dissolving into the earth. The whispers faded, replaced by an unnatural silence. Elise collapsed to her knees, the staff clattering beside her. The villagers stood motionless, eyes wide as they surveyed the devastation. Samuel limped to her side, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You did it," he whispered, voice breaking. A flicker of movement caught her eye, and she turned to see a small black rune carved into the cobblestone, glowing faintly before fading. Elise's stomach twisted. This wasn't over. The mist might have retreated, but it hadn't been banished for good. Villagers began to pick up the wounded and tend to the fallen. Hollow Creek was scarred, but standing. Elise's eyes met Samuel's, and he nodded, reading her thought. They would rebuild, but they would also prepare. Late that night, as the village tried to find sleep, Elise stood by her window, the staff leaning against the wall. She traced the newly discovered runes from the journal, eyes scanning for answers that might keep the whispers at bay. And as the first light of dawn kissed the rooftops of Hollow Creek, Elise promised the unseen watchers beyond the mist, "We will be ready. We will be ready." Days turned into weeks, and Hollow Creek slowly pieced itself back together. The scarred land was a testament to their battle, but also to their resilience. Elise became the village's anchor, guiding them through the recovery and reinforcing their newfound knowledge. Samuel resumed training with the villagers, his once light-hearted demeanor now tinged with a quiet seriousness. He and Elise had taken to studying the ancient texts together, finding layers of forgotten lore hidden within the cryptic runes. One evening, as the village was quiet, and the stars stretched endlessly above, a deep rumbling shook the ground. Elisa and Samuel exchanged worried glances. The earth wasn't supposed to tremble unless something beneath it stirred. They rushed outside, the cold night air stinging their skin. The villagers had gathered in the square, eyes wide with fear as the rumbling continued. A crack in the center of the village formed, thin and dark, exuding a strange, cold mist. Elise stepped forward, the staff in her hand glowing faintly. The fissure widened, revealing what looked like ancient, root-like tendrils moving slowly, as if awakening from a long sleep. Whispers, softer this time, but insistent, seeped into the air. Samuel placed a protective hand on Elise's arm. "Is it them again?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Elise nodded, though her gaze was fixed on the fissure. This was different, older, and somehow more unsettling. Before she could react, one of the tendrils shot up, wrapping itself around the edge of the crack. The whispers grew louder, speaking in a language neither of them recognized. The rune on Elise's staff pulsed in response. A shiver ran down her spine as a face began to form in the mist, gaunt, with eyes as hollow as the ones before, but older, more knowing. This being had waited a long time, and its patience had run out. The figure spoke, the language guttural and ancient. Samuel flinched, and Elise felt the words claw at her mind, leaving trails of icy dread. She forced herself to respond, raising the staff and channeling a protective rune. The tendrils retreated slightly, as if testing her resolve. The figure's hollow eyes narrowed, and a thin smile cracked across its face. "You learned well," it said, voice now shifting to a rough version of their tongue. "But knowledge will not be enough." The figure dissolved, leaving only the tendrils and the ever-growing fissure. Elise felt her knees weaken, but kept her stance. Samuel turned to the villagers. "We need to move away from here, now." As the villagers retreated, the ground shuddered once more. The fissure erupted, spewing dark mist that spread like veins across the cobblestones. Elise threw another rune in the air, summoning a barrier that glowed with blue fire. The mist recoiled, hissing as it touched the barrier. Elise kept her focus steady, sweat beading on her brow. Samuel's voice cut through the noise, rallying the villagers to form a defensive circle. A sudden gust of wind swept through the village, carrying with it the scent of ancient decay. Elisa's eyes darted to the horizon, where a darker mass of fog crept closer, almost sentient in its advance. Out of the creeping fog emerged figures clad in tattered cloaks, their faces obscured. But for the glint of hollow eye, these were not mere shadows, but emissaries, agents of the true power buried deep beneath Hollow Creek. The air thickened, and Elise felt it pressing against her chest. Each breath labored. She knew this fight would test not just their strength, but their unity. The villagers, sensing her determination, gripped their weapons tighter. One of the cloaked figures stepped forward, raising a hand etched with shifting runes. A deep, guttural chant filled the square, making the air hum with dark energy. Elise recognized it as a summoning spell and reacted instinctively. She slammed the base of the staff into the ground, releasing a shock wave of light that swept through the square. The chanting figure staggered, its form flickering like a dying flame. The other emissaries paused, their movement stilled. Samuel took the opportunity to throw his spear, its iron tip glowing blue. It pierced through the chest of one of the figures, and with a sharp wail, it crumbled to dust. But the victory was fleeting. The other emissaries moved in unison, advancing with inhuman speed. The barrier Elise had conjured trembled under the strain as they threw themselves against it, their bodies morphing into shapes that scraped and clawed at the light. "Elise!" Samuel shouted as a crack appeared in the barrier, splintering like ice. Elise's heart pounded, and she drew on the last of her strength to hold it together. The staff glowed brighter, almost blinding. The emissaries shrieked, their forms wavering as they retreated a step. Elise felt hope flicker to life, only to be snuffed out when the fissure behind her exploded with a deafening roar. A dark, towering figure emerged, eyes like burning coals set in a skeletal face. Its presence sucked the warmth from the air, and even the emissaries stilled in deference. This was their master, the one spoken of in the oldest, darkest texts. The figure's gaze swept the square, pausing on Elise. A voice as cold as winter filled her mind. "You think light can banish shadow? You know nothing of what lies beyond." Before she could respond, it raised a bony hand, and a wave of darkness shot toward her. Elise braced, drawing every bit of energy she had left, and unleashed it in a blast that met the darkness head on. The collision of light and shadow threw everyone back. Elise hit the ground hard, the staff clattering from her grasp. Samuel scrambled to her side, lifting her up as the village around them struggled to stand. The figure remained unmoved, watching them with detached curiosity. "You resist well," it said, almost amused. "But this is merely the beginning." Elise felt her vision blur as exhaustion claimed her. The last thing she saw before darkness overtook her was Samuel's determined face, and the villagers standing firm, ready for what would come next. She awoke hours later in the old church, now transformed into their stronghold. Sunlight filtered through the cracked windows, and Samuel sat beside her, eyes weary but unwavering. "We held them back," he said softly. "For now." Elise took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in her chest. The staff was laid beside her, its glow dim. "We need to find out what it is," she said, voice hoarse. "If we're to survive the next wave, we need answers." Elise pushed herself to sit up, each movement sending jolts of pain through her muscles. The soft murmur of the villagers outside the church seeped into the quiet space, blending with the distant calls of birds returning to the morning sky. Samuel handed her a cup of water. "You need rest, but I know you won't listen," he said with a half smile. She took the cup, nodding, her fingers brushing against his for a brief moment before she drank deeply. "Did the journal reveal anything more?" she asked after a pause. Samuel's expression darkened. He picked up the worn book from the pew beside them and flipped to a page Elise hadn't seen before, its text now illuminated with shifting crimson runes. "It speaks of a guardian," Samuel said, "one who was bound long ago, sealed to keep whatever lies beneath from rising. But with each clash, the seal weakens." Elise traced the runes with a finger, their glow warming her skin. "We need to find us guardian. If we can strengthen the seal, we might push back whatever's coming." A knock at the heavy church door interrupted their conversation. Samuel stood and opened it to reveal a familiar face. The old bookshop keeper, his eyes wide with urgency. "You must come with me," he rasped. "There's something you need to see." The old man led them through narrow alleys, and past burnt-out buildings until they reached the outskirts of the village. A hidden path wound up the hill, leading to an ancient, moss-covered shrine. The shrine pulsed with an unseen energy, whispering secrets that tickled the edge of hearing. Elise approached cautiously, her staff beginning to glow in response. "This place is older than Hollow Creek itself," the bookshop keeper whispered. Samuel knelt, brushing aside debris to reveal intricate carvings that resembled the runes in Elise's journal. These carvings, they tell of a guardian spirit bound by blood and oath. A sudden wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and decay. Elisa gripped her staff as a faint voice, no more than a breath, spoke, "Awaken me, or face the endless night." Samuel's eyes met Elisa, fear mingling with determination. "We have to summon it," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The villagers were counting on them, and the thought steeled their resolve. The bookshop keeper produced a small iron knife, its blade darkened with age. "Blood is the key," he said, handing it to Elise. She hesitated only for a moment before nicking her palm, letting her blood drip onto the shrine. The ground shuddered, and light erupted from the carvings. It raced in veins across the stone, forming a circle that blazed like fire. A shape began to materialize within the glow, tall and cloaked in ethereal light. The guardian's eyes opened, twin pools of white fire that held the weight of centuries. It looked down at Elise and Samuel, its gaze measuring, questioning. "Why do you call upon the old power?" Its voice resonated, deep and melodic. "To protect Hollow Creek," Elise replied, raising her chin despite the quaking in her knees. "The seal weakens, and the darkness stirs." The guardian's expression shifted, a flicker of both anger and sadness. "It was bound for a reason." The guardian said, its voice quieter now, "But you are right. The seal falters." It reached out, touching Elise's staff, imbuing it with a new brilliant light that seared through the encroaching mist. With a sigh that sounded like wind through ancient trees, the guardian lifted its arms, and the light from the shrine exploded outward. The village below glowed briefly as the mist around it retreated, hissing and crackling. The villagers watched in awe, some dropping their weapons, eyes wide with hope. Samuel turned to Elise, the fire of determination in his eyes renewed. "This is the power we needed," he said. The guardian's light dimmed, and it spoke once more. "The darkness is deeper than you know. You must find the 3 keys of shadow to strengthen the seal permanently. Without them, my power is only temporary." "Where do we find these keys?" Elise asked, desperation sharpening her voice. The guardian's form began to waver, its energy spent. "Look to the forgotten places, where night never ends," it whispered before fading completely. Silence settled over the clearing. The villagers below began to cheer, mistaking the retreat of the fog for victory. Elisa and Samuel exchanged a knowing glance. This was only the beginning of their quest. Returning to the village, Elise briefed the villagers on what they'd learned. Fear flashed in their eyes, but resolve soon followed. They'd survived one battle, they would face the next with courage. That night, Elise pored with the journal and the old texts. The term "Binding 3 Keys of Shadow" appeared only in fragmented references, hinting at ancient relics tied to the primordial dark. Samuel brought her a steaming cup of tea, his own eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "I'll take the first watch," he said, glancing at the edge of the forest where the mist still loomed, waiting. Hours passed, and sleep refused to claim Elise. The night stretched on, heavy with silence until a distant cry pierced it. She rushed outside, staff in hand, finding Samuel already alert, spear poised. A villager ran toward them, eyes wide with terror. "The woods! Something's in the woods," he gasped, pointing back at the dark tree line. Shadows writhed, more solid than mist, but still indistinct. Samuel nodded at Elise, and they moved toward the forest edge, heartbeats synchronized with the distant thrumming of the night. They would face whatever new terror awaited together. The shadows shifted, forming shapes with glowing eyes. These weren't the emissaries. They were something different, an echo of the darkness that awaited them. Elise felt a chill deeper than fear. "Hold fast," Samuel said, planting his feet as the shadows moved closer. Elise whispered a protective incantation. The staff's glow, casting a circle of light that pushed back the advancing dark. The first shadow lunged, silent but swift. Samuel met it with his spear, the iron tip sinking into its formless body and making it dissipate like smoke. But there were more, so many more. The shadows encircled them, moving like predators with a hunger that defied nature. Elise's heart raced, but she held her ground, drawing another rune in the air with her staff. The glowing symbol hovered, crackling with energy. Samuel thrust his spear into another shadow, dispersing it, but his eyes darted to the trees, watching for signs of larger threats. "We can't hold them all night," he shouted, sweat glistening on his brow. The rune Elise created burst into a pulse of light, pushing the shadow figures back a few paces. They hissed, a sound that curdled the blood, but they did not retreat far. Their eyes glistened with the promise of patient malice. A deep growl came from the forest, resonating in the air and sending a tremor through the ground. The shadows paused, as if awaiting orders. Out of the blackness stepped a tall figure, its silhouette crowned with twisted, branching antlers. The figure was cloaked in dark, flowing robes that seemed woven from the night itself. It raised a hand, and the shadow stilled, watching Elise and Samuel with eyes that betrayed a glimmer of something ancient and knowing. The antlered figure spoke, its voice layered, echoing as if several voices spoke in unison. "You seek the keys of shadow," it said, the question hanging in the air like a dare. "Do you know the cost?" Elise felt it hard, stepping forward despite the urge to shrink back. "We seek them to protect our people," she said, meeting the figure's eyes. They were deep and dark, endless wells of forgotten stories. The figure tilted its head, a slow, deliberate movement. "The first key lies in the hollow of echoes, where voices of the past linger. It is guarded by your deepest fear," it whispered. Samuel's grip on his spear tightened. The Hollow of Echoes was a place only spoken of in fearful tones, where people who entered sometimes returned half mad or not at all. The shadows began to recede, as if melting into the earth. The antlered figure gave a final nod before its form unraveled into black mist, leaving the night unsettlingly quiet. "Did it just help us?" Samuel asked, his voice cautious. Elise didn't answer, eyes fixed on where the figure had stood. Help or warning she couldn't tell, but the path forward was now clear. They returned to the village at dawn. The light casting away the terrors of the night. Elise gathered supplies while Samuel briefed the villagers on their mission. There were murmurs of worry but also hope. "We leave at noon," Elise told Samuel as she finished tying her satchel. He nodded, his jaw set in determination. The journey would be perilous, but they had no choice. As they departed, a few villagers watched them go, their expressions a mix of pride and fear. Samuel looked back one last time, silently promising them he had returned. The horse beyond Hollow Creek was dense, its ancient trees twisted into shapes that cast strange shadows on the ground. Each step felt like venturing deeper into another realm. Birdsong faded as they approached the boundary of the Hollow of Echoes. The air grew colder, and the sunlight struggled to pierce through the tangled canopy. Elise paused, feeling a natural chill creep up her spine. Whispers brushed past her ears, faint, indistinct murmurs that made her skin crawl. They had arrived. Samuel's eyes darted around as the whispers grew louder. They spoke in broken fragments of memories, voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. "Stay close," Elise said, her voice steady despite the shiver in her bones. She lifted her staff, its glow piercing the gloom and pushing back the voices, but only just. The ground was soft beneath their boots, covered in a thin layer of blackened moss. Samuel glanced down and noticed footprints that didn't belong to them. Bare feet, small and scattered. "Someone else has been here," he whispered. Elise nodded, eyes scanning the darkness. "Or something still is," she replied. A sudden, sharp laugh cut through the whispers, clear and childlike. It echoed around them, bouncing off unseen walls. Samuel raised his spear, but there was nothing to strike. Out of the corner of her eye, Elise saw movement. A shadow darted behind a tree, and then another across their path. "They're playing with us," she said, frustration edging her voice. Suddenly, the ground beneath them gave way, and they fell into darkness. Elise hit the earth below with a painful thud, her staff rolling out of reach. Samuel's voice echoed nearby, faint but alive. Groaning, she sat up and reached for her staff. Its glow now faint. The air down here was damp and heavy, smelling of decay and wet stone. "Samuel," she called, her voice hushed. "There," he replied, shifting into view. He limped over, clutching his side. Before they could assess their injuries, a soft hum surrounded them, as if they were being watched by many unseen eyes. The hum grew into words, repeating a single sentence over and over. "What is given must be taken." Elise shuddered, recognizing the line from an old legend about the Hollow. A flicker of movement caught Samuel's eye. Shapes moved in the dark, figures with faces pale and eyes as black as coal. They stood in a semicircle, watching silently. Elise raised her staff, the dim glow flaring in protest. "We mean no harm," she said, hoping reason could pierce whatever madness controlled this place. One of the figures stepped forward, a woman in tattered robes, her eyes hollow and empty. "The Earth's key is bound by a loss," she said in a voice that echoed with sadness. Samuel and Elise exchanged a glance. "Loss," Samuel repeated, the word weighing heavily in the air. Elise's heart clenched as memories of her mother surfaced, unbidden and sharp. Before she could speak, the woman reached out a ghostly hand, touching Elise's chest. Cold shot through her, and the vision of her mother's last moments appeared vividly before her eyes. Tears welled up as the scene unfolded, the grief as fresh as if it had just happened. Samuel shouted her name, breaking through the vision's hold. Elise gasped, stumbling back, the vision fading. The figures watched with passive, empty expressions. Only in facing what has been lost can the first key be found, the woman whispered. Samuel placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. We're here together, he said. Elise nodded, pushing down the pain and focusing on the task. She had to confront the memory, not let it drown her. Closing her eyes, she embraced the sorrow, feeling it twist and coil, but no longer fighting it. When she opened her eyes, the woman was holding a small obsidian stone. The first key. Elisa reached for it, the stone cold, but oddly comforting in her palm. The figures around them faded into mist, and the air felt less oppressive. They had passed the first trial. Samuel exhaled in relief, the tension leaving his shoulders. One down, he said, his voice shaky but relieved. Elise nodded, clutching the key tightly. 2 more remained. A narrow path illuminated itself before them, leading out of the hollow. They exchanged a glance, a silent promise passing between them. They would face whatever came next, side by side. As they stepped forward, the whispers faded behind them, replaced by the steady sound of their footsteps and the knowledge that they were now part of something much larger, a battle that would test the very soul of Hollow Creek